Hello and welcome to our Community Reads event. I hope it's the first of many, but what a great one we have to start with. This event, in case you didn't know, is a collaboration between the town libraries and Noble High School. My name is Sharon Taylor and I am the high school district librarian. I am joined today by Marcy Paletta. Where are you, Marcy? Director of the Martha Sawyer Community Library, Sharon Kelly, the director of the Berwick Public Library, and Laura Cashville, the director of the North Berwick Public Library. Well, January 16th of this year, I received an email from Melissa Paley, a Great Bay Piscataqua waterkeeper, with an interesting proposition, an invite to their book discussion. After communicating with our wonderful librarians, we decided to have our own community read so we didn't have to travel to Portsmouth. We are very glad you are here with us today and so excited to introduce Dr. Moore to you. Dr. Moore, who wrote many things, but the book that we're going to be discussing today, is joining us here today to share details about the book. Dr. Moore is a senior fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy and a two-time EPI award-winning writer for imediaethics.org. I had to look up what an EPI was.
Yeah, I had to also.
Editors and publishers awarded him. Now, if editors and publishers are giving you awards, there's something special about you. He's published scores of articles about public opinion, survey methodology, and American and international politics in scholarly journals, newspapers, books, magazines, and online publications. I'm so pleased to welcome you here today, and we do have books for sale and audiobooks for sale after the presentation. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Sharon, and thanks to all of you who, to Sharon Taylor, Laura Cashville, Marcy Paletta, and Sharon Kelly, all of those people who worked together to bring this together, and I appreciate the invitation to come and to speak. The story itself is a fascinating one. It's been mostly, the way I presented it, focused on New Hampshire, but the effect, the implications go all the way along the seacoast from Portsmouth to Cape Ann. So although I talk about what happened in New Hampshire, the refinery that they wanted to put into that small town would have had repercussions throughout the seacoast area. So if you go on to YouTube and you do a search for the battle for Durham Point, you'll find a 5 to 8 minute video. But it has to be Durham, D-U-R-H-A-M. They misspelled it. If you do the Durham Point, you can't find it. But if you do Durham Point, you can find this little video. And so I'm going to quote from that video as it provided kind of an overview of what was going on. And I'll also show you here. New Hampshire is rich in natural beauty. Its 18 miles of beaches and rugged coastline are fed by a web of rivers and estuaries that fuel the economy for many New Hampshire communities. This is a story about legacy and how the actions of ordinary people can impact the lives of many for generations to come. It is also a story about recognition of the often underappreciated role that women play in society. And it is a story about today, balancing the reality of our energy needs and understanding our responsibilities to our community and to our descendants. But to understand this responsibility, we must first take a step back into the past. So we're going back to the past of 1973. At that time, if you recall, it was the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Economic growth was sluggish and stagnant, which gave, at the same time, there was high inflation. It was an unusual period, and that's when we first heard the term stagflation. There's a fuel shortage, long gas lines, high prices for food, food and fuel. And you can see all that. This was a common sight that we had. If you wanted to get gas, every other day you would get it if your license plate had an odd number. And the other 3 days a week, you would get it if it was an even number or a letter. And then on Sunday, you were lucky to get it at all. Okay. So in this period, as R.E. Onassis, best known as the one who married Jackie Kennedy, decided to make a proposal for the town of Durham. This is a kind of benign picture of R.E. Onassis. A more representative picture of him as a guy who expected to get what he wanted. And there were other antagonists in this story. This is William Loeb, publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, which was a really bully pulpit kind of newspaper. And this guy he was horrible. He had, front page editorials, and he'd always go after politicians and their family. And in one case, for the governor's 16-year-old daughter, he went after her because she was asked at one point, because she was the governor's daughter, about marijuana. And she said, well, I don't see anything wrong with it. Not that she was smoking it herself, but that was her response. And Loeb went after her. She had a nervous breakdown, couldn't complete her senior year. This guy was mean. He was a bully, and we've seen bullies since then, unfortunately. And this was the very southern governor, Meldrum Thompson, from Georgia. Very polite, very easy to talk with, but a real SOB himself. He decided that he didn't like his opponents in the Democratic Party, and he decided, even in the Republican Party, because at that time there was something called liberal Republicans, and that was kind of the predominant Republican Party in the state, in New Hampshire at the time. But he and Loeb really kind of upended that, and he went down to apparently there's a record of all criminal activities held in Massachusetts for all of New England. And he went down there personally to seek out information about his opponents. But that wasn't the craziest thing he did. He also decided to wanted to arm the National Guard in New Hampshire with nuclear weapons. And he also wanted to, I think he wanted to allow parts of Canada to secede from Canada and to join with New Hampshire. So there were a lot of interesting things about this governor. In any case, he got elected in 1972 in the November. So 1973 was his, beginning of his first term. And he decided what he really wanted in New Hampshire was an oil refinery. He just thought that would, and he didn't. The other 5 New England governors were working to see where would be the best place for an oil refinery, but he wanted it here. And it so happened that Aristotle Onassis had been looking to set up an oil refinery himself. And it turned out that his major chief of staff, so to speak, Constantine Gratzos, knew Peter Boras, who had been a candidate for the U.S. Senate in New Hampshire. And so Boras contacted his friend. They contacted Onassis and said, okay, let's try to do it. And we'll go build one on Durham Point. But they decided that he would build the largest oil refinery in the world on Durham Point. 400,000 barrels of oil per day. A recent oil refinery had been established in Southern California, which was considered pretty large at the time, 70,000 barrels of oil a day. This was going to be 400,000. It would have been cost them $600 million, or in $3.2 billion in today's amount. And the promises of this is that it would create 15,000 new jobs. It would provide more gas and home heating oil for the Durham area. And there would be a large tax break for Durham. Those were the promises. This was the refinery. If you take a look at the outline in black, that is the town of Durham. The red area is the part of Durham that the oil refinery was proposed to take over, to buy up all that area. They also were going to have a two-berth terminal design positioned off Lunging Island, off the Isles of Shoals, capable of handling very large containers with 80-foot draft, humongous. Lunging Island would be for staging and Star Island for navigational. Now that's all in New Hampshire, you notice. They didn't get into Maine, they were still doing in New Hampshire. The other islands, Appledore and so on, belong to Maine. Well, here is a picture of Honeymoon Cottage on Lunging Island. And it's a real pretty, you can see what it looks like. This is kind of a profile. And if you see that little protrusion there, you can see that's Honeymoon Cottage. This is a picture of the ship containing oil. Okay, here we go. Compared to Lunging Island. Yeah, wow, that gives you an idea. Here's another one. Oh, no, I didn't have another one. So, where they decided, this is a photo of Durham looking out toward the Oyster River, which would go out eventually down the Piscataqua River and out to the ocean. And so that whole green area up in the upper right-hand corner is where they were going to build the oil refinery. And they came up with a model, and this is a picture of people in Concord, the capital, of course, where they're looking at this model that had been produced by Olympic refineries. I'll show you the model right here. The scale model of the Olympic refinery shows only the refinery itself and its storage tanks. It says only 1,200 acres will be used of the 3,000 acres, but there were also going to be satellite industries that would feed off of that. The other thing about the model, which people didn't know at the time, is that the refinery itself, it's hard to see, so it looked pretty small, a lot of the storage tanks around, but the storage tanks were to one degree, and the other the model size, and then for the actual refinery itself, they made it half a degree, half as large as it would be in comparison to the rest. So it was a misleading model at best. In any case, so here's what happened. One of the residents, Katie Wheeler, wrote a letter to him in November after it was found out. It said, please come to Gratsos, Constantine Gratsos. Please come to Durham, walk around the town, visit a town meeting, see the beauties of Durham Point, and talk to the people before you continue with your plans to build a refinery which would irrevocably destroy one of the last places to live. We in Durham will fight to the end to prevent the destruction of Durham Point and our tiny bay, but we wish that you would come to visit us so that you will understand and perhaps sympathize with our opposition. And this is the response they got. Dear Mrs. Wheeler, I wish to acknowledge receipt of your letter of November 29th, which I thank you. I had the opportunity both in the past and the summer to visit New Hampshire, and particularly the Durham Peninsula, and I cannot agree with you more as to the loveliness of the place. Unfortunately, the evolution of the world since the Industrial Revolution and the universal population explosion will inevitably result in the elimination of all that you and I and many other people cherish. In other words, today and in the future, we will have to choose between existence and beauty. Aesthetically, and then he adds this, aesthetically, a modern refinery, when illuminated, looks more like a Christmas tree than anything else, and is not uglier than the modern sculptural and masterpieces adorning the streets and major capitals of the world. This guy was clearly not an art critic. Very truly yours. Well, this is what a refinery looks like from ground level. This is what it looks like when it's lit up. This is what a Christmas tree looks like when it's lit up. So there was a fundamental philosophical divide between the people in Durham and the oil refinery people. Well, there were three major protagonists that I cover in the book, leaders, female leaders. The first was Nancy Sandberg, who was a young woman of 24 with a daughter who was in kindergarten and who lived on Durham Point. And she considered herself just a housewife, but was suddenly thrown into a leadership position, which I'll talk about in a second. Well, I'll talk about it right now. She was the one who initially picked up on the fact that there were a lot of people out there trying to buy property in Durham Point. They all seemed to be Greek, and they wanted to buy all this property, options on property. And they said, oh, I need it for hunting, or a hunting preserve, or I need it just for my family. No development when asked, and so on. And so she was the one who essentially was the leader of an organization that came into being called Save Our Shores, or SOS. The second is Dudley Dudley. Dudley is an iconic representative in the state of New Hampshire. Everybody knows her for a lot of different reasons, but the fact that her first name and last name are the same helps people remember very clearly who Dudley Dudley. But she was a first-term legislator, the first woman elected as a Democrat from the town of Durham. They had been Republicans all until then. Occasionally there was a Democrat who was elected, but we had 4 reps. You remember, we have 400 in our House of Representatives and 24 senators. So we have the second largest, actually the third largest representative body behind the UK and the United States in the world, and that is New Hampshire. So our 400 House members, we get 4 in the state of Durham. And she ran and really did her best, and she came in 4th. But 4th was good enough, so she was the rep and the only Democrat. And she was the one who had the responsibility of fighting the effort of the governor to get an oil refinery by passing legislation that would force an oil refinery onto a town. And then finally, the other person is Phyllis Bennett. Phyllis and her husband, Steve Bennett, founded, just coincidentally, a brand new newspaper in the Seacoast area, in the New Hampshire Seacoast area, that went from Durham down to Hampton, down to Seabrook. They were idealists. They had worked themselves on the Baltimore Sun, and they had invested money in another newspaper, and they had this pot of money, and they decided to found their own newspaper, and they founded something called Public Occurrences. This was the first newspaper published in America in 1680. It lasted 1 edition, and then the editor was thrown into jail. So the second edition came out in August of 1973, when Phyllis and Steve decided to found their own newspaper called Public Occurrences. And Public Occurrences was crucial in the effort to reject the oil refinery. The first big important thing that the public occurrences did was in October 5th of 1973. You can see the date up there. It published an article on the inside, but on the outside it said, "An oil refinery on Durham Point." Basically, a lot of people had talked about all these so-called realtors out there trying to buy up property, but nobody knew why. They did know that the governor wanted an oil refinery, but the governor wasn't saying anything, and they couldn't find out what it was for. And so the newspaper just raised the question, an oil refinery on Durham Point. And that had a catalytic action or reaction to it. For Dudley, who was a legislator, suddenly okay, here's a problem, for the town. And she knew right away that for Great Bay and for Little Bay, for Piscataqua, this was not something that would be good for the environment. And Nancy and her group that had formed beforehand but didn't know what they were fighting against suddenly realized that they had what it is that they had to fight. And throughout that period, from October until the final vote in March, there were literally hundreds of articles that were in public occurrences about the various aspects, the news about it, which included a lot of reports done by engineers and other experts at UNH. These big reports that talked about what the implications were for an oil refinery, and every one of those reports was published in toto in the newspaper, which allowed the people in the Seacoast area to be aware of what was going on. This is this is by December 14th, 1973. This is a weekly newspaper, came out every Friday, and that was the case of Evelyn Brown. Evelyn Brown had 2 pieces of property, and she was the person who had rejected. She didn't know. She was told this was not going to be for development, so she'd agreed to sell one small portion of it under false pretenses, and when she considered. So she was very upset when she found out that it was for an oil refinery. One of the realtors had talked to her at one point and went on the phone and said, "Yeah," while it was on the phone, and they said the realtors, Peter Boras, had been by to look at her place while she wasn't there, peered around, and she said she wasn't going to sell, and they said, "I bet, little lady, we're going to buy those wide planks right out from under you." Well, this was creepy in a lot of different ways. One, that they had come around, and number 2, that they had said they were going to take her property. The cartoonist in the public occurrences was Bob Nelson. And so this is, if you take a look, this actually is Evelyn Brown. This is Bob Nelson. That's Dudley. Not sure who that is. This is Onassis. This is Meldrum Thompson. That's Peter Boras. And those are other non-entities right there. But little lady, we only wish to build a nature park, a retirement home, and a game preserve. So it was a really clever. So immediately SOS got together and they started organizing. And the thing that they had to do is to tell people what an oil refinery would be like. So they very quickly in December, this was in October, when they first became aware, and it wasn't until November before Thanksgiving that Governor Meldrum Thompson came out and officially acknowledged, yes, this is an oil refinery. So by early December, SOS had come and had a big meeting in the high school where 700 people turned out. 700 people is actually pretty substantial, one of the highest turnouts for any town meeting. When they actually voted on it the following March, they had something like just short of 1,400 people vote. So to get roughly I mean, not necessarily all 700 were voters, but that still gives you kind of an idea of why 700 turning out for the first oil refinery is good. SOS also got petitions, signed petitions and things like that. And they eventually got up to 5,000 petitions. Now you might say in a town that doesn't have that many adults in it, I mean, they have a lot of students, how do they get 5,000 petitions? But they did, in fact, allow students to sign. They indicated they were a student. They indicated whether they're a registered voter and so on. And in order to demonstrate the success of this effort, they went out and along Main Street, they stretched out these petitions. They taped them together and stretched them out from one end of town to another. Unless you've been through Durham, you may not appreciate how long that was, but it was a
across the street and people drove under it.
Yeah, oh yeah. So it was definitely a quarter of a mile or so long from one end to the other. They also had Dudley take them up to the governor. Well, as you know, the governor was in favor of the oil refinery, and he wasn't all that enamored with the notion of people signing petitions. So he went. So she did, in fact, take them up to the governor, and after 5 minutes there, she was thrown out of his office and told her. But what happened is, he said to her, when she went in there, she had been in the executive council office, in the executive council room, which is right adjacent to the governor's office. And there was a reporter there, and he had been asking her about the petitions, and she explained to him what they were all about. But this was her third time to see the governor. The two previous times had been postponed. The first time she was called and told that, and the second time she was there and then just told to go home. And the reason is that the governor, the second time, that the governor was going down to New York City to see if he could get more fuel for snowmobiles. And she was just, snowmobiles? We don't have enough gas for automobiles, much less for snowmobiles. What's he doing? So anyway, she's there the third time. She doesn't know whether she's going to get in. But suddenly, the secretary comes out and says, the governor will see you now. So she walks in to the governor. She's got all these things, and she dumps them on a table that is there. And he gets upset with her. And he tells her that, she tells him that these are petitions, that she had been talking to a reporter. And he says, so is that why you came here, just so you could get publicity? He said, no, Governor, I came here because I thought you might be interested in what your constituents would like to know. He said, how do I know they're my constituents? And she said, well, they indicated where they live. And he said, well, are they, how do I know if they're even registered voters? And she said, well, you know, Governor, whether they're registered voters or not, they are your constituents. And he said, get off your high horse, stop talking. So then he finally said to her, I don't understand why Durham doesn't want the oil refinery. It would be good for everybody. And she said, well, she said, you know, Governor, he said, it's really important because of the oil shortage. She said, well, you know, Governor, an oil refinery won't help the oil shortage. The fact is, we still need the oil, and that is our problem. And so he threw her out of the office, said, get out of my office, get off your high horse. And this is a picture of her taken by a reporter shortly after she got out, in which she said she was badly treated by the governor. But she did remind the governor that he had promised the selectmen in the town that he would not force the oil refinery on a town that didn't want it. But he was still working with legislators who were crafting legislation that would give the authority to the government to override what a town might want. So another person who was really key in this whole operation was Chris Spiro. Chris Spiro was the assistant minority leader. He himself was Greek. He called himself the other Greek. I'm the other Greek. And he opposed to the refinery. And he was the one who worked behind the scenes. While Dudley was She was the one who was sponsoring legislation. She was arguing for it, but he was the one behind the scenes talking to people, talking to legislators, talking to them about, and for each one trying to figure out what would make them persuaded to vote against that legislation. So finally, the Onassis comes. They see all this opposition in the town, and so Onassis comes, and they think Onassis is going to come because he's typically been pretty, even though he's kind of a man who expects to get what he wants, I'll put it that way, he's been known for his charm. After all, he married Jackie Onassis, so he was known for his charm, but they thought maybe he could come and charm some of the legislators. And this is a picture of him with the governor on the left at the press conference after he came. The problem is that when he arrived, everybody in Durham knew that he was coming. And they knew, because the governor announced it, that when he arrived, he would arrive on Adams Point, which is at the southern end, at the southern end of, yeah. Is that right? Northern end, maybe. Anyway, yeah, northern end of Durham Point. And that's where the oil pipeline would have come in. And he was going to land in a helicopter and then drive over Durham Point with the governor. And then, I don't know if they were going to drive back to Concord or go back to the helicopter. But everybody knew that the helicopter was coming, so when they heard it, they went out and they had messages in the snow. And that message says, "Not here." Another message that said, "Ari, go home." So when he got to Adams Point in the helicopter, and the helicopter landed, he didn't get out. The governor's limousine was there, ready to take Onassis, but Onassis wouldn't get out. And it so happened that Sharon Meeker, one of the people who worked on SOS, had got in her car with the anti-refinery, with all sorts of anti-refinery messages on her car, bumper stickers, and she drives down to Adams Point. She doesn't make it in time, but on the way back comes the governor's car, and the governor is just glaring at her for what they had done. So Onassis, when we actually see Onassis here, this is after his humiliating ride, helicopter ride. Not only that, people didn't know it at the time, but he was kind of sick. And he was old and worn out, and he did not make a good impression. So this is Public Occurrences continuing to provide information. And as you can see, Thompson may skirt the Durham zoning and taxes. He was, another key issue was the taking of Lunging Island. How they needed Lunging Island. And they decided they would try to get it. Peter Boros, the Randall family is the one that owned it. And Peter Boros, who was the original, one of the original so-called realtors who went around trying to buy property, and the person who brought essentially brought Constantine Gratsos and the governor together. He first made the offer to the Randall saying it would be about, they wanted it for a resort development, lying about what they really wanted for $500,000. They said no. Then they were visited by George Stamolitos, who's a friend of Boros, who denied it was related to the oil refinery. And eventually he admitted it, that it was for the oil refinery. And after several visits, the Randalls were advised by the attorneys that they should go along with the option, because if they didn't, they might get it. It was evaluated, some much lower. Well, as you can see, the riot increased the value from $1,200 to $65,000, but it was far below the 500,000 they could get. So they finally agreed. And it was like a death in the family, according to the Randalls, because they'd had cottage, honeymoon cottage there. Eventually, of course, because we know what the outcome was, the options were never exercised. But at the time, it was felt that this was really a bad development. So, in the final week before the town voted in March. And it so happened that the legislature was also voting in March. The town had to vote on whether they would accept zoning changes to allow for a refinery. At the state level, they were voting on a bill that would set up a site committee to facilitate the establishment of an oil refinery if one were accepted. And there was an amendment to it that would allow the site committee to have the final say over where it would be, regardless of what a town wanted. In New Hampshire, home rule is a big deal. And so the question is whether or not the state would override home rule. Well, the Olympic presentation was held in the gymnasium, the UNH gymnasium. And on the left is Robert Greene from Purwitz and Company, which was the company that was hired by Onassis to go out and find a place to locate the refinery. And they got up there and they were trying to answer questions that people had because they had just finally presented their detailed plan for the refinery. And this was only, the week before the actual vote. So a lot of people asked questions. One of the people to ask questions was up here on the left-hand side, Celeste DeMambro, who was a member of the SOS committee. And her question was, does Olympics promise still stand mainly to uphold the wishes of the people of Durham? And if not, how can we be expected to believe any of your other promises? Well, that was a good question to ask, because they were, in fact, cooperating with the Republicans in the House, because it was mostly a Republican state, to essentially provide the site committee with authority to establish it. And then they had another presentation a couple days later, and she just got up and said, leave your number at the front desk and don't call us, we'll call you. The plan had called for Star Island. Lunging Island was going to be the place where they unload the oil into the pipes and everything. Star Island was supposed to be a navigation center. And they implied that they had it, but Barbara Rutledge, who was a member of the board, says Olympic doesn't have an option on Star Island and they won't sell 1 inch of land at any price. There was one other presentation at the time. It was by a woman named Cliff Horrigan. She was a hydrologist. She already had children, but she was going back to school and studying hydrology. And she had read the plan very carefully, and she got up in front of Robert Greene. I'll go back to Robert Greene right there just for a second. And got up and Robert Greene and said, according to your plan, you require 6,000 gallons of fresh water per minute. Where are you going to get 6,000 gallons of fresh water per minute? Well, see, he's there with all of his experts. He had 18 experts sitting behind him. So, and he's standing up there like this. So he turns around and he goes back there, and there's this whisper, and he comes back and he says, well, apparently, actually, we'll only need 3,000 gallons of fresh water per minute. And so she says, where are you going to get 3,000 gallons of water per minute? And this is true. I'm not exaggerating a bit. He turns around again. He goes back, whisper, whisper, whisper. He comes back and he says, actually, we only need 1,500 gallons of water per minute. Everybody just, whatever credibility he had, which wasn't much anyway, had just been shot by that presentation. In any case, the vote comes, and on the Sunday before the vote, Olympic Refineries sponsored a insert that went into all of the Sunday newspapers in the state. And in that insert, it was several pages of it. It said, help bring it where you can see. They did have a poll that was taken of New Hampshire overall about whether people supported the refinery. And the answer typically was, yeah, they supported a refinery, 65%. But they never asked, would you support a refinery in your town? And would you support a refinery if a town doesn't want it? So the governor got all real excited about the poll, and he got a lot of, and he sent out to all the towns. He said, why don't you go ahead and have an unofficial assessment of public opinion? Ask people. It was too late to have an official resolution or anything, but just let's do kind of a straw poll to see what people would like. And apparently what happened is that when it got out there, a lot of people said, yeah, they support it, but not if it violated home rule. So that kind of backfired. On the middle of the insert were the names of all 424 members of the state legislature with their home telephone numbers. And they were told to call them and speak in favor of refinery. That also backfired because most of the calls they got were against the refinery rather than for the refinery. But that didn't necessarily mean public opinion has only so much influence, particularly for corporate organizations and power. So the most important thing from Durham's point of view was to have a clear statement that they didn't want the oil refinery. If there was any ambiguity about it, it would really open up the notion, well, this is just, 50-50, why should they do it? So there was a vote. There was a vote, and it was covered by all of the major news media were there. They first, before they actually even voted on the oil refinery, they had to go through a whole series of propositions to see whether or not the people at the meeting would approve radio and TV coverage, and they did. So that was fine. And then they voted, and there were a lot more people who showed up than there were registered voters. So only the registered voters, of course, were allowed to vote, and all the other people were shunted into another part of the school where they had a TV. And they voted. And this is a picture, 1,200 times no. There were about 170 or 180 who said yes. And it came out in public occurrences 9-1, which was pretty substantial. Hampton voted against it also. So did Rye. So that Newmarket voted for it, which is just right down the road from Durham, which was kind of a real problem. It's more of a mill town, and maybe the promises were better, but in Durham, they hadn't necessarily been subjected to the same kind of information. But in any case, it was a worry because home rule may be okay if a town says no, but if it were also put into Durham, Newmarket, only right down the road, the same environmental consequences would have occurred. So then came the vote in the House, and this is a kind of a picture that was taken of the House of Representatives on March 7th. That was the very next day. Dudley feels that the way the vote actually turned out could have been much worse if it hadn't happened just the day after the overwhelming Durham vote. In any case, they voted. So It's just a House vote because it's a House bill. It would then have to go to the Senate. But the House bill, Dudley had a bill that was a home rule bill. But before they could vote on the home rule bill, they had to vote on this site selection committee bill and the amendment. So it was all about the amendment. If you voted for the amendment, you were voting for the refinery because it would have allowed the site committee to establish the refinery wherever they wanted to. And a vote no was against the refinery. So, and it was called the Reed Amendment because Maurice Reed, the representative, was the one who made it. So the first thing was a voice vote. And when they first had the voice vote, they said everybody in favor, that would be in favor of the amendment, in favor of the refinery, say aye. And it was a humongous roar, which caused Prospero and Dudley and Nancy and all the anti-refinery people to be really upset. But then they said, all those opposed, another humongous roar, which, how could all these people produce such loud noise? In any case, they did. So then they said, okay, now we'll have a standing vote. And a standing vote means that every person who wanted to vote for it, they would just stand. But it wasn't recorded. It was just a standing vote. So this allows a precise measure in a way that the voice vote obviously does not. So when they did the standing vote, they had yes 121, no 209, which of course caused everybody who was against the refinery to be really excited about it. But then a member of the Republican Party who wanted to shame some of the people who were voting against it called for a roll call vote. So they had to have a roll call vote. And as he called for a roll call vote, the majority leader said, I see that there are several members who are trying to leave. So Sergeant at Arms, would you please close the door? So they closed the door after some of them had escaped. And then they voted again. And this time they voted, it was a 32% yes and 68% no. So with the roll call vote, once they had the actual margin increased against it from 88 to 114. So the oil refinery was defeated as far as placing it in New Hampshire, in Durham. There was the fear that the Olympic refineries might try to go to Newmarket, or they might try to go to Rochester, because Rochester had also voted in favor of it. But it turns out that Onassis was humiliated. They hadn't really figured out where they would place it in Newmarket. They didn't have the same open area that Durham had, or Rochester. They still hadn't quite figured out what they would do with the 6,000 or 1,500 gallons of fresh water per minute. So Onassis himself flew back down to the Bahamas where he met up with Jackie, and then he flew back to England because he was sick. But he was trying to rewrite his will to get Jackie out of it, because he and Jackie both had their own divorce attorneys by then. And he went to the hospital in London, and he was suffering from an internal disease, and he actually died 1 year and 1 week after the New Hampshire vote. But the effort to continue with the refinery had long since stopped. So at the 40th anniversary of that, the three women who were there, Nancy Sandberg, Phyllis Bennett, and Dudley in that era, they made this nice little granite bench, which is out there on Wagon Hill Farm. Wagon Hill Farm, which is, if you've been down Route 4, you can see a big wagon hill off on the right, and that's Wagon Hill Farm. And if you go over that down to where the bay is, you'll find this granite bench. And so this year is the 50th anniversary. So it was 2014 when the 40th anniversary that there was a presentation like this, where a lot of the participants were still there, and that's when wow, this is a really interesting story, and so that's when I started to take notes and do the research on public occurrences and other newspaper articles. And so now we can be thankful that the seacoast area has not become an industrial wasteland, which is what I think could very well have happened. So that's the basic story. The book itself covers, for those of you who've read it, it covers some of the more personal aspects of it, the problems that each of the women faced, the sexist problems that they faced, and also the personal problems. But this at least provides you an overview of what the whole issue was about. So, questions that you may want to have? Yes? Someone's probably going to have to tell me.
What prompted you to take an interest in this?
What?
What prompted you to take an interest in this?
Well, we live in Durham, and I saw the 40th anniversary. And Zelda and I, my wife and I, we originally lived in Lee, which is just right down the road, but I taught at the university, and we came in '72. So in '73, '74, we were aware of everything that was going on. We read public occurrences, and we knew Dudley, and she was just, she later got on the executive council and was the first woman ever elected to the governor's executive council. And her painting, a painting of her, is now in the executive council office building, a room. So we knew all about Dudley, and of course we learned about Nancy and Phyllis. She was a major role. So it was all very interesting, and I just thought, this is a story that should be told. I should admit that I have been trying to write novels with little success, but at least I had taken a lot of writing courses, so I thought this was an opportunity to write about something that was really important and to get it out there. So that's how I became involved. Okay.
I thought it was grimly fascinating about William Loeb and what he put in newspapers.
Oh.
I mean, he was so biased and so ruthless.
Yeah, he was. William Loeb was definitely ruthless and biased, and there's an interesting article that was published in an academic journal that compared New Hampshire and Vermont in 1945 or 1950s, and how they were very similar both in politics and other things. And then they went their different ways. And a large part of New Hampshire becoming as conservative and Republican as it was, this author attributed to William Loeb and the way he went after politicians. There used to be a kind of, I would say, center-right, politically, center-right prevalence in the state of New Hampshire. But all those liberal Republicans, liberal is a center, moderate Republicans, eventually became Democrats. And if there were conservative Democrats, they eventually became Republicans. So it really sorted out. But a good part of that sorting was accomplished under the bullying of William Loeb. But yeah, sorry, you had?
Was there ever any evidence that Onassis had access to that amount of oil to ship over here to begin with? To have this 600,000 gallon refinery operate?
That's a lot of oil, and there was only intimations that he had some kind of an agreement either with Saudi Arabia. He had originally had, years earlier, he had some kind of an agreement going with Saudi Arabia where he would be the oil refinery and the distributor and so on. But the U.S. government didn't like it, and Robert Kennedy was his nemesis, who was in the Justice Department at that time and did his best to prevent that thing from coming about. So there's a whole subtext of story between Onassis and Robert Kennedy and Onassis and Jackie Kennedy. And I mean, there's a really fascinating story there that I read about when I was doing this research. Unfortunately, I don't have any original research, so I can't write about it myself, but it's there for people to read about. Any other questions, Jeff?
The role that, by the way, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
It's
Thank
so
you.
informative. The publication Public Occurrences played a really instrumental role in getting the word out and getting information to people. I wonder if you could speak to today where local newspapers are disappearing and being taken up by larger papers and the issues around that.
Public Occurrences, I think, did a job that probably wouldn't be done today. It focused on local areas. I just talked about what it did with respect to the refinery, but it covered other news stories, local news stories about what was happening to this trailer camp in Newmarket and what was happening that they found that, for example, there were maybe 3 times as many female teachers, but 15 times as many male superintendents or principals. You know, those kinds of articles. She also covered what was going on in the local movie theaters and arts and so on. So they provided a real coverage, and they focused on the local news. Today, my sense is that, you know, the local newspapers, they just can't afford. They can't afford because all the advertising has gone online. They can't afford to do the kind of research or the kind of reporting that would be required. I don't think that social media would be an adequate substitute. It would be somewhat of a substitute because you could find out a lot. But what Public Occurrences did, they took these reports and they illustrated and they put them in the center of the newspaper or on different pages, and it was every week you would get information. Social media is more hit and miss. You know, you hit something and maybe there would be somebody who would have a newsletter, and that might work today. You know, a newsletter they would send out. But again, you need the reporting. And what Public Occurrences did is they paid their reporters decent salaries. As it turns out, after, if you read the book, you'll find out that eventually Steve left. And so Phyllis was by herself, taking care of 2 kids and running the newspaper. And she went and tried to get help. And she did get financial help from the Boston Globe. And the Boston Globe essentially helped keep that paper going for up until 1975. And the Boston Globe was having difficulty financially even, and so they couldn't afford to continue support, so the newspaper closed down. And she went to the New Hampshire Humanities Council, Phyllis did, and then eventually worked at the university for 25 years. But anyway, that's kind of a long way of saying it's really questionable today whether if an event like that occurred or the whole controversy, whether we would have the information that we really need as citizens to be able to make a judgment. Because I just think you know what's happening to local newspapers. It's too bad. Yeah.
Were you personally involved in any of the SOS activism?
No, I wasn't. No, we lived in Lee. You know, It's a whole town away, you know. So, well, no, I wasn't involved. I was a member of the political science department, and it turned out that one of the members of the political science department, Larry O'Connell, was a selectman. And he was, if you read the book, you'll find he was among the 5 selectmen. He was the only one who came out right away and said, no refinery. The other selectmen they were waffling because they said, well, suppose a refinery does come. If we've gone on the record as being absolutely against it, we won't have any influence with I don't know, with somebody anyway. They wouldn't their credibility would be lost with respect to any objections they might make to some of the finer details. So, but Larry was a young guy at the time, and he'd been born and raised in New Hampshire. He went to UNH. He was absolutely against the oil refinery, just as Dudley was. She didn't need anybody to tell what the details were.
Could you speak to the fact that they were claiming that this was going to make oil, car gas, etc., more available to New Hampshire, and the fact that it would not have at all because it's federal?
Yeah, the allocation of oil and gas is done at a federal level, and it's done at a regional level. And one of the things that the newspaper pointed out, and Dudley pointed out, and Nancy pointed out, is that if you go down to, I forgot where in New Jersey, I forget the town in New Jersey, which is right near the oil refineries. What?
Trenton?
Well, Trenton would be a good place. But anyway, their gas lines were just as long as the gas lines up here, as they were in Galveston or in Houston, Texas, you know, and it's because the oil is a national commodity and is distributed. So the notion that somehow Durham was going to benefit was total fabrication. The other big thing is there would be 15,000 new jobs. They figured at best there might be 1,000 new jobs, and probably mostly people who were expert in dealing with oil refinery pipes and stuff like that. And so it probably wouldn't have been very many jobs actually for local people. And the third one was that there would be a big tax break. Well, one of the reports done by an economist at UNH pointed out that according to New Hampshire law, they could not tax the oil refinery itself because of the way the refinery, because of the way the law was written. It had to do with energy and the moving parts to it. All they could tax was one of these maintenance sheds that would be put up for, and that's the only taxable advantage that Durham would have had.
And in fact, the town would have more responsibilities for people, for schooling,
Right.
I mean, it would have been a disaster to have that influx.
It would have, yes. Yeah.
You think if they picked
Another town,
down,
they would have gotten it? Do you think if they picked on another town that they would have had success?
different outcome,
Did it,
If
another,
they chose a different town like
because UNH
New England?
has schools.
Do you think, did you get the question?
I'm sorry.
Do you think if they had picked a different town besides Durham with UNH, that they would have had a different outcome?
They might have, but they would have had to. What they decided to do is they just looked at they did a very cursory glance. And what they found is that they had all that area around Durham Point. And this was ideal because it was big and it was close. They wanted something that was, that would minimize the pipeline. So the pipeline went from Rye across Pease Air Force Base into Durham. And that was kind of a short distance. They would have had to find some other town, and they might have been more successful if they had found the appropriate room, say, in Newmarket, because Newmarket was more attuned to it. And so if Newmarket had not objected to it, then the refinery would have gone in, assuming they could have solved the gallons of water problem.
It turns out in a spokesman for bees said they didn't have the right way to drive a pipeline through bees. In the end, they couldn't have done it the way they wanted to do it. The bees would never opened up their land for the project.
You think bees would never have opened up their land?
That's what it says in the book.
Oh, they hadn't done it so far. Right. They had not done it. And it was a question of whether they would. On the other hand, I don't think I said in the book that they would not do it, just that they hadn't done it. Yeah. But remember, Nixon was president. He was talking and he was trying to do, he would have, to the extent that he was involved, he would have supported, I think he would have supported the oil refinery going in there. So I'm not sure whether Pease would or would not have allowed it to go in. Of course, ultimately the Air Force abandoned the Air Force base as such. And so I don't know what would have happened had they been able to go through. But my sense is, with the amount of money and the amount of effort involved, that, well, I guess I'm basically a pessimist. I would think that I think that the U.S. government probably would have said, yeah, allow it to go through. Because I don't think I don't know how crucial Pease was in 1973-74 to air defense or to our defense. I don't know, so I could be wrong. But anyway, it's an open question. So.
Do you know if the governor ever got in trouble for some of the outlandish things he did, such as pretending that a telegram came from the Department of Energy? I mean, that's got to be illegal in some way. He was trying to sway the minds with an illegal ploy, right?
Yeah. Well, just to briefly, for those of you who don't know what happened right before everybody voted in the House. After everybody had spoken, the last person was Dudley. After she had spoken, and before they could vote, one representative came in and said, "Oh, I have a telegram from the energy office the energy czar down in Washington, D.C., which says that if New Hampshire has a refinery, it would get more oil and gas than it does now." That's what it said. That was the final thing that was said. Well, later, one of the reps went and checked and found out that no such telegram had ever been sent from Washington. We're getting used to, these days, used to the kind of fake news that we see with people just saying things and expecting you to believe it. So no, the answer to your question is no. Thompson was never held accountable. Nobody apparently ever did anything to them. It's politics, you know? And we see that today, that a lot of people say things and get away with it. It's just.
I'd like to say that you're wrong, but I know you're not.
Okay.
And as far as, that's just the way that it is. That was the discouraging part of the book, but I was so inspired by the activism, and the dedication of the women, and not just women, but, the leaders of the group that opposed that. If they hadn't done that, if they hadn't taken the initiative, I'm not sure what the outcome would have been, but.
Yeah, I think that's a good statement, because initially it sounded like it was a pretty good deal in one sense. And more jobs, tax break, more gas and oil, and unless you've got the reports and the evidence that people believe it. They'll believe anything until we get facts that contrary. So yeah, I think what they did was just incredible. And if you know.
I don't think the refinery would have ever come to fruition. Number one, Onassis died. Number two, that site could have never delivered all the requirements. Can you imagine towns agreeing to pipelines to take their secondary wastewater from their town over to Durham? To get even to get the 1,500 gallons per minute of water that they needed to cool that refinery.
Well, they might have only needed 500 gallons.
But that's 500 per minute. And the river, the Oyster River, was already at capacity. So even Newmarket as a site might not have been able to deliver all the requirements. And this company really didn't know. They didn't know what they were doing. And it was a privately held company by a massive. So ultimately, I think it would have failed. But I'm glad that all the initiative was taken right up front and there was never a chance of it.
Yeah.
Even to begin to clear anything or do any damage.
One of the members of SOS, Sharon Meeker, was married to Dave Meeker. Dave Meeker is a mathematician. And Dave Meeker's theory was he didn't really want the oil refinery as much as he wanted storage tanks. That he really wanted to store that as a way for distribution. I thought that was a kind of a wacky theory, but he kind of agreed with you in the sense that he thought that it really wouldn't have been able to come about at the size that they wanted to do. But a lot of damage would have been done just in the effort to start it. And even if you'd had an oil refinery that wasn't of that capacity, maybe even only 100,000, 1/4 of capacity, because they only needed 1/4 of the amount of water. Even if you'd only had at that level, you can imagine, that's so. It's staggering to think of how large such a refinery actually is. And then the satellite industries, the other oil refinery, the other oil products and things like that, they would have been probably around the seacoast area. Maine wouldn't have been directly affected, but indirectly. And you know what happened down in Rye? Is everybody ready to go? Do you want me to? I'll take 3 minutes. I'll tell you what happened in Rye, because this is really, really a crazy thing. What happened in Rye is Robert Greene and his cohort wanted to show what would happen as they put the pipeline into Rye, because the pipeline had to go into Rye and then overland, underwater from Lunging Island, overland, so on. So a pilot who lived in Rye was talking to one of the selectmen in Rye and said that he's a pilot, he was going down to New York City, and he was going to stop in and see what Olympic refineries is all about. So he did. He went to there, and he said, I'm from Rye, and they said, well, if you want to, we're kind of busy, but if you want to watch this film, you can watch this film. This shows you what we need to do in order to put the pipeline in there. So he watched the film, and when he came out, he said, when you go up there, when you actually go up to Rye, and you're going to show them what needs to be done, be sure to show them that film.
You set that up perfectly in the book.
Be sure to show them that film. So they did. And Greene and his compatriot were not there at the opening of the Rye meeting. Instead, there were a couple of professors who showed what oil spills would be like, what the effect of oil spills would be like, and they did all this research. And so eventually, Robert Greene comes down, and they go and they start talking about it. And there are all sorts of questions from the people in Rye, the fishermen in Rye. What about your research? What has that shown? What's going to be the impact of oil spills? Are there going to be oil spills? How much? And he said, well, we just haven't done the research yet. So Hawcroft, Professor Hawcroft, had this great big thing, and he's sitting off to the side, and he takes his big thing, and they're talking up there. He goes up there and he tosses it from him and says, there's the research. And everybody kind of, cheers and everything. But that's not the big deal. They then decide to show the film. And this is the film that's going to show what happens when you have to have this underground pipeline. So eventually, but this is a picture of what happened in Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't exactly, it wasn't an account of what had happened, but an account of what had happened someplace else. And so it starts off with this kind of music, and then they show the land, and then all of a sudden, boom! You see a big explosion as all this ground is tossed around, and the oil, the beach and so on. And then they go on in the video to explain how they needed to do that first in order to create the depth that they needed for the pipeline. Wow. After that, there was no one in that room who could possibly be considered supportive of an oil refinery. It would have destroyed the leaks, the oil spills alone would have destroyed the lobster fishing and the other fishing. Blowing up the beach. We're talking about tourists, we're talking about New Hampshire and the seacoast, very short seacoast, 18 miles. Maine, of course, has thousands of miles when you count everything. But New Hampshire has only 18 miles, and you can see they rely on that for tourism and for fishing. And this would have just, so that was a faux pas, to say the least. That was not the best strategic move that was made by Olympic. But anyway, that's what happened
It
in
is odd that
what
they
happened in
chose
Rye.
New Hampshire with our tiny little bit of coastline rather than any of the, most of the other states that are on the Atlantic. I mean,
Yeah, it was.
poor choice.
Yeah, but it was a political choice
Yeah.
because the governor wanted it,
Yeah.
and so on.
Thought it would
Yeah.
be easy.
So
mentioned New Jersey, New Hampshire becomes New Jersey. We could look like New Jersey.
We could have looked like New Jersey.
yeah, that's what everybody was saying, which is unfortunate because it's also New Jersey is also called the Garden State, and there are a lot of really beautiful parts of New Jersey. But whenever anybody thinks of New Jersey, they think of Trenton. They think of probably the worst parts of New Jersey. But yeah, that's what everybody kept saying. We don't want this to become New Jersey, so which is fine because we know what they mean. But so okay, all right. Well, thank you for coming.